misbehaves. Who's doing that?
Hey,
Okay.
hey, Elias.
Okay, well, it's 6 o'clock and we want to be mindful of people's time. So Dr. Berberg, if you can pull yep, there it goes. And then we'll welcome people in. Let's go to the first slide.
I will. Hold on.
Okay.
As soon as I can get my Zoom moving the way I need to. Okay.
Okay, perfect. All right, we can let people in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Wherever you're joining us from, please let us know where you're joining us from. I am Dr. Neil Lester. I'm a professor here at Arizona State University. I've been here for a very long time, and I'm very excited to be the founding director of the university initiative called Project Humanities, where we are very excited to host this podcast club segment tonight on procedural justice. Not quite yet, Dr. Not yet.
Sorry.
Procedural fairness and practice. We're very excited about this conversation, you can see. Exploring justice beyond the classroom. And but before we get into the actual business, we want to pay homage to our ancestral indigenous lands by acknowledging that Project Humanities sits on ancestral lands of indigenous people, past, present, and future. We thank and honor Native American tribes and sovereign nations of the Salt River Valley, including the Akimel O'odham and the Ankh, Akimel O'odham, and Peepash nations, whose stewardship of this land and these waterways allows us to be here now. In addition, we honor their continued and many contributions today. So thank you again for joining us. We do not take for granted that you could be elsewhere and that there are lots of things that are demanding your attention and your time. But we do want to thank you and to remind those who don't know that Project Humanities is a multiple award-winning university initiative that brings people together to do three things: to talk, listen, with the potential of connecting. And we do this across the valley, we do this across the nation, but we also do this virtually when we're not doing it in person so that we can stay connected to those people who are in places that are not local. So again, as you sign in, please tell us where you're joining us from. All right. Um, our conversation tonight really takes place within the context of what we call Humanity 101. Humanity 101 it's not a class. It is rather a series of conversations, activities, and strategies that highlight some principles that we think are at the heart of not only diversity, the bad D word, but also justice. When we talk about empathy, compassion, kindness, self-reflection, forgiveness, those are not necessarily something that's faith-based, but rather based in our faith in humanity. So at various times throughout, our team members will be posting that link, and we just ask you to take the pledge. We're not asking you for money, we're asking you for a commitment to uphold these principles that we call Humanity 101. And it's in that spirit that we have this conversation tonight about procedural justice or procedural unfairness beyond the courtroom. And facilitating this conversation is our wonderful faculty liaison, Dr. Gregory Broberg. And some of you may know Dr. Broberg because Dr. Broberg has facilitated other conversations with us and has been with us now. Is it 3 years, Dr. Broberg?
3 years, yes.
Yeah, in some capacity. But what he's always done is challenged us to think and to think about things that we're not only usually thinking about, whether it's serial killers or he teaches a wonderful class in that. But for those who don't know, Dr. Broberg is an associate teaching professor here at ASU in the School of Social Transformation. Dr. Broberg has been here since 2017, I believe is what your bio says, and has done extensive work before coming to ASU with K through 12 education. He served on numerous committees and supported teachers and continues to do that, administrators and policymakers. I love this. The research interests include issues related to educational inequality, transformative pedagogy, teacher leadership and innovation, juvenile and restorative justice. So it is no question question whatsoever that Dr. Broberg should be the one who is facilitating this with two students. So Dr. Broberg, thank you for agreeing to do it. And we'll be here as your virtual pew members, chiming in as you take the reins to this conversation. So thank you and the students for participating tonight. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Broberg.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lester. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We are here to talk about procedural justice beyond the courtroom, and we're going to go into that in a minute. But before we do that, I'd love to have my colleagues who are joining us from the ASU Pre-Law Society Club here at ASU, and I'm so excited to have them because very often these intergenerational conversations are so important with the issues that we're facing today. So first, I'll ask Jackson to introduce himself. So Jackson, do you want to let us know a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Broberg. My name is Jackson Rubin. I am the president of the Pre-Law Society at ASU. I'm a senior studying economics and political science with a minor in justice studies. I am looking to go to law school post-grad and am grateful to be here today to discuss procedural justice, restorative justice, and especially from the experiences, my experience, Ilani's experience, to get a great discussion about what can we do to promote more and give more understanding to normal folks who may not have the best idea of what procedural fairness may be.
Wonderful. And Leilani, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So, hi everyone. My name's Leilani. I am the outreach coordinator for the Pre-Law Society. I'm a senior studying family and human development with a minor in justice studies and a certificate in political entrepreneurship. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation. Just like Jackson said, I'm like excited to just shoot off thoughts and be able to hold this with a lot of people being able to listen and maybe connect to that.
And that's wonderful. That's exactly what we're here for. And so I want to get this kicked off. I want to start off with a conversation with the two of you, to set the stage, which is if for those of you who listen to the podcast focused a lot on several key issues. One is, I would say, as these different programs that have blossomed out of procedural unfairness, which is very, very interesting. And me as a professor in justice studies, oftentimes that's how I frame the work I do. I focus more on the injustice side than the justice side because once you uncover it, you have a little bit easier way to begin to pull it apart and figure out what's going on. And in the case of this procedural unfairness, they were talking about a lot of different programs. So I thought we'd carve out these. I'm just going to carve them out quickly. Then Jackson and Leilani, I'm going to ask you guys to give some of your past experience with some of these if you have them. And that is, especially in the K-12 area, because the podcast focused on a couple of programmatic efforts that have been done to help solve procedural unfairness. So one is this aspect of restorative practices. And this aspect of restorative practices is done in schools. And the most common occurrent thing is that I can relate to, and we've actually had conversations about this in the Tempe Municipal Court, is programs like Teen Court, where we attempt to resolve conflicts in schools by creating a courtroom setting in schools that we think procedurally will come to some just outcomes. So teen court is one area that they talked about with these restorative practices. We also have, and they mentioned the restorative justice movement, and I'm very familiar with that because years ago, let's just say years ago, I was trained to be a victim offender mediator with juvenile cases. And this was very, very popular in the 1990s, early 2000s. A lot of states had gone to solve juvenile problems by putting victims and offenders together to talk through a particular incident with the hopes of restoring the victim. And that's really something that is important with restorative justice is to, you're looking at the harm that was done and you want to restore that. So we have these initiatives like teen court that's done in schools. We have this victim offender piece. Let's talk a little bit, and Jackson, I'll start with you. What has been your experience, coming through the K-12 environment and even to the college thing? Have you been involved in any of these type of programs like teen court, things of this nature?
I have not, no, but I definitely have heard of Teen Court and the work that is done through that. And I think that that's really important work, especially for those um, restorative justice practices. It's important to start, and they mentioned this in the podcast too, of starting young in the education system, and getting those practices done through programs like Teen Court or other programs in order to kind of set that foundation, throughout, their, secondary education or into college and adulthood.
So Leilani, let's ask you, have you had any experiences in this area?
I haven't had any personal experiences. Just like Jackson, I've heard of like teen court. I do think that things like this are so important. Just kind of reflecting on if a lot of people were kind of subject to this education, what would the outcomes kind of look like? And that'd be interesting to see if that was like built into a curriculum of kind of going back and forth and showing kind of the right and wrongs and how outcomes can play out. What would these children take into high school and college where a lot of these students are coming back and doing things like that could get them in trouble and reflecting on that education. So I definitely think it's something that should be heard of a lot and kind of put more into the education system. And then kind of going on to the communication with the responder and victim. I think that isn't a really important thing to talk about as well. I think kind of putting them both in the room, of course, under like supervision and things like that is really cool and of course takes a lot of trust and a lot of communication. And it's not every day you get to see someone that affected a victim be able to apologize and be able to come back and reflect on their actions and to be able to have that victim be able to kind of accept that apology. And I really think that creates a lot of trust and a lot of betterment with different people. So, again, I think it's a lot of things that are unsaid but are there in the world and that should be like established more.
Yeah,
Well,
and
and I think
jumping
that
off of
oh, go ahead, Jackson. Sorry.
No, jumping off of what Leilani was saying, they mention in the podcast the experience with the queer individual and how he got into a physical altercation after encountering homophobia, and there was somewhat of a power dynamic there where the facilitator categorized them as the responsible party who instigated the encounter. And the individual said that physical violence was categorized as legitimate violence, but not homophobia. And talking about what Leilani was discussing about being able to listen and show empathy and communicate that through that mutual dialogue. I think that is a great way to kind of uh, you know show that procedural fairness and that restorative justice through these programs like we've been discussing, so that we can come to these mutual understandings and that empathy to more advance that justice further.
Well, and I think, Jackson, you brought up a great comment and you were a great lead for me on this next part, which is wonderful. This aspect of, and you talked about the situation they discussed in the podcast, which I found very compelling. And I've seen this actually play out in a variety of circumstances. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience, and then get the two of you to kind of talk about it because you're future attorneys and you've not gone to law school yet. So you haven't been kind of indoctrinated into that aspect of things. And so, when we think about restorative justice, and the work that's done, really the goal is to repair harm. That has always been the primary goal of restorative justice. And I always, when I was trained as a mediator, the goal as a mediator, and I was trained as a humanistic mediator, not as a traditional mediator. A humanistic mediator is more of an individual that goes in, and their goal is to come to a consensus rather than having a traditional mediator who is the talking point for both sides. In fact, in humanistic mediation, and when I train students to do this, you're really sitting back and you're listening. You let both parties have that conversation amongst one another, because for this whole aspect of talking about power imbalances to me come to come to light when institutional individuals step into a process that they don't belong in. So when I train, like I said, when I train people, and I've been trained both as in victim offender mediation, and I was trained in this humanistic mediation. And when you guys, Jackson, you and Leilani in law school, they're trained as being more of an arbitrator, which is you become the focal point between the two individuals. When I train students, I remind them that your job is to come to an agreement with the two individuals talking to one another, not to bring in your power into that conversation. And Jackson, you mentioned the example from the podcast where you have a situation that starts with this homophobic situation that led to violence between the two individuals. And the homophobic incident was kind of excused as not being pertinent. They wanted to focus on the physical violence, and schools do this all the time when we talk about different behavior situations in schools. And I always remind teachers and principals and that I work with that it's important that you listen and understand the antecedent, what happened before this whole incident happened. And so I'm curious from the two of you, you have this experience that you come and you also have your experience in post-secondary education with power imbalances. Let's talk a little bit about how power imbalances have been seen from your both of your standpoints. How have you seen these power imbalances? And then also I've always liked to push a little bit and say, as you move into this law thing, what would you like to see law become? As we talk about this area where we're talking about procedural fairness, what do you think should be done? So Leilani, I'll start with you. I started with Jackson last time.
Yeah, of course. So, going on the first question, kind of like how I've seen these power imbalances. Very rarely do you see a teacher come to you and want to have like a conversation where they're on the same level as you, or if you're talking to an attorney that's been in the field for a while, or anyone kind of that nature. It's very rare that they come to you and want to talk to you and kind of treat you on the same level. And sometimes it's really hard trying to get into the field and being able to kind of discuss things. And they're always like talking about their experiences and how much more education. And that's great in some aspects, but you never really can kind of say what you've done or kind of have a conversation. So in that way, I feel like I've experienced power imbalances. Kind of going into a segue to the second question, I feel like um a lot in the like realm of the legal field, law field, we see a lot of the traditional aspects. And in the podcast, this was mentioned how a lot of the time, a lot of the older individuals in the legal or law practices, they're used to a lot of the things being the same and learning the same way from the people before, and change is very rare and it happens over time, but it's definitely something hard to do no matter what it is. So hopefully with this day and age, we see with this generation a lot of pushback. So I'm hoping going into the legal career I want, kind of experiencing that pushback in different ways and having more of a voice for things that our generation feels are important too.
Yeah, I love that, Leilani. And I think kind of, piggybacking off of that in terms of the, law school and post law school, I'm part-time at a local law firm, and there's definitely, the classic, power dynamic, as you see, in Suits, where the partners, show power over the associates, and whatnot. Um, but as Leilani was saying, there's definitely institutional power, in the law, where traditions are passed down. You learn through experience, in the law, and you learn from, those who've been practicing law for the last several decades. Um, and those traditions, those practices are passed down. And it's very difficult, in the field of law to, kind of, branch off and, begin, a more progressive, kind of values or practices, in the field of law. And, as Leilani was, talking about, it's, that power dynamic, is real, and it's definitely difficult to break through. I think one kind of solution to that, is just, as we were discussing before, more understanding, more, empathy for that. And as they were discussing in the podcast, the need for, restorative justice or procedural fairness needs an PR team. And I think this is something that, we should discuss further. But, in order to, change the system, in order to, make inroads into, more progressive or, better, solutions. We need, normal people or politicians, at the local level to better understand, what these terms mean.
And I think that leads us to a great second question for us to discuss, which is, there was a couple of things talked about in the podcast that I thought was interesting. They talked about these secular shamans, these individuals who kind of take on these roles as experts. And I'm always concerned when anyone comes on and says, I always remind students I'm not an expert in certain things, and so I always try to frame it as, I may have a set of expertise, but you may have something that combats that or could butt up against that. And when they mentioned about these secular shamans, they were framing it as that much of this is done for money or to gain money. So, you could imagine that you're building a program. And so to keep that program going, you have to do something, like grant funding or other things. And I know this happens in courts a lot. It happens at ASU, where we have certain programs that we fund certain things. And they were talking about key stakeholders. And so I'm wondering what you guys think, because, as we talk about attorneys, who are mostly the individuals involved, there's certainly, you have judges, you have attorneys, you have these court actors, and they're heartfelt in some areas. They're dedicated to their definition of justice, but is there a way to get around this aspect of people becoming entrenched in a certain thing and then just falling into a practice simply to do the practice rather than being concerned with the outcome of things? Because procedural justice is not necessarily about an outcome. You can have fairness. Some people perceive that there's fairness in the process, and therefore they excuse a bad outcome. And so I'd like to hear from the two of you. Is this something that how do we get around this? I guess I would ask that question. How do you think you two would get around this, in your minds?
Yeah, I think
Jackson, we can start with you. So go ahead.
Sure. I think, something that they discussed in the podcast, towards the end is that, people that are affected, don't deserve someone who has had, a 1 week crash course in, procedural fairness, or, how to do, restorative practices. They deserve, someone who does things well, and that costs money, as you were talking about. And I think that's important, to point out, is that, this costs money. There are, costs associated with this. But, as an economics major, I'm concerned with trade-offs and you know with what my return on investment is in terms of restoring these people or promoting certain actions or practices that can eventually help someone, and that can affect an entire community down the road. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of going off of what Jackson said in the first half about it being about money. I think that a lot of the time when people find out that you want to go into some certain career, it's all about the money. Like, how much are you making? Like, is this a really good career choice? And it's really sad to hear that these days, and how kind of like the world is thinking, how society is thinking, how everything is about the cost and the money. And at the end of the day, a lot of that does depend on like how much are these workers getting paid? How much does it cost to get someone with the expertise to help these people? But it also is just sad to see how this society kind of runs, because in a perfect society, which hopefully one day, it won't be about the money, it'll be just about helping people in these problems. But kind of going back on just like the ultimate like cost of these things, setting up these nonprofits are so hard, um and to be able to kind of come up with cost effective ways will be really interesting to see later on in life, to see if like the new generation of people that are coming in to be these lawyers, to be working with nonprofits, if they really do it for the money, or if what they really want to do is help these people and do it at a pro bono or reduced cost, or kind of take it on in the side. So I really think that is something to bring to the table of like how these people in this new generation that are becoming these lawyers um have all these like movements and sayings and things that they want to do, and how that will reflect on in their work kind of life balance.
I think adding on to that, Leilani, one of the biggest problems with how restorative justice is often implemented is that it tries to standardize something that can't really be standardized. Justice, as they were discussing, is personal. It's messy, it's emotional, and it's tied to where you come from. And they were discussing intake forms or one size fits all approaches, and how that doesn't work. And if you try to fit someone's life into a box and their trauma into someone else's trauma, or comparing someone to someone else, you're already setting them up to be misunderstood, and um, that that doesn't promote any restorative practice or help them in any unique way. You want to paint the full picture in order to maximize that overall restoration or benefit.
And both of you kind of talk about something that this kind of brings up our next discussion point, which is I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Lester out of this, because when I first started with Project Humanities, I wasn't aware that they were doing a homeless outreach program, and Dr. Lester has been committed to this homeless outreach. In fact, I would say it's probably been a struggle for him to get everything kind of the widgets all in line with things, and to there's a lot of movement of different institutional actors and other things that go on with this. But I was always amazed when I actually started or participated in volunteering, how something kind of small can work into something larger. And I oftentimes wonder, and I'm going to give you another example. After seeing, the work that Dr. Lester did, some of the work that I do with the Tempe Municipal Courts, I've tried to push the courts into how can we get community members more involved in this aspect of justice, especially community-based type of programming. And I'm going to give you an example of one we're working on right now. I've sat in, I've been involved with the Tempe Municipal Courts for about 6 years now, doing working with different students, placing them to do their thesis work or special projects. And every year I meet with the presiding judge, who's Judge Kevin Kane, and his court administrator, Alexis Allen, who are wonderful individuals. And we just talk about things that are going on in the court. And we just had a conversation about Veterans Court, which we can talk a little bit more, which is kind of a, um, is a problem-solving court aspect. So it is more of a twist to the traditional procedural justice. But in this one conversation I'm thinking about, is we were talking about individuals who plead, basically plea out for DUI offenses. And I never knew, and I mean, I've worked in various juvenile type of situations. I always know there's a lot of procedures. I never knew how many issues have to be resolved for an individual who pleads guilty to a DUI offense in this lower jurisdictional court. There is a laundry list of things that they have to go through in order to get their driver's license back. If they need an apparatus to put in their car because they have to make sure that they're not ingesting alcohol and driving. I was shocked, and so we asked, well, what? And we were having a conversation with the judge about this, and he said, a lot of these individuals who come through the court struggle with keeping up with all this because there's so many institutional aspects, like we were talking about, that the standardization of things, and all of the aspects that kind of go into it, and you remove the individual from these things. And so we were talking about, well, maybe we can get students who want to participate in an internship program to be there to be a navigator to help individuals navigate these different processes. Something small, but would be very community focused. And so I'm going to ask the two of you, what should we be doing? And when I say we, I mean myself and other individuals. We're a Research One institution. We should be doing as much as we can. Our charter specifically talks about how we impact communities that we are supposed to be serving. So what should we be doing to get students more connected with these real world procedural justice issues that are going on? So I'm curious what the two of you have to say about that. Leilani, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that's such a cool and amazing thing. I think the biggest thing is like kind of connecting to students. There's so many, even like at ASU alone, there's so many students that want to get involved but don't necessarily know how to get involved. Just talking to people like in the different clubs I'm in, specifically the Pre-Law Society, they always say how hard it is to show up to a meeting, or being able to kind of take that step in the right direction of getting involved. So going and advertising, kind of showing them all of the different ways that they can get involved, because there's so many excited students that want to get involved, that have that heart, that really want to learn about the system, to better the system and start early on, but they just don't know how to start. I know a lot of people are afraid to talk to professors, are afraid to talk to people that are on the e-board, and sometimes, like, even beginning my freshman year, I was a little scared to talk to everyone above me. So I think the biggest way is just kind of spreading the word, whether that's through social media or flyers, or kind of just showing them the different like routes that they can take, and showing them like how like a day-to-day kind of like process would look like, and the outcomes that they can get from that experience.
Yeah, I think, also, as we're doing right now, with the Pre-Law Society, speaking on this issue is, being able to reach out to student organizations. There are, thousands of student organizations on campus, dozens, if not hundreds of cultural organizations, who, fit into a specific demographic. And, those students are specifically concerned with their personal identities, and how that's being affected. So I think that, if we were to reach out to those student organizations, and there's power in that community. If one person, in that community, is to, talk about these issues, share how everyone in that community may be affected, and what ways that they may be able to educate themselves or participate further in these. With the new administration coming in, we've seen a bunch of programs, DEI programs, have been cut or eliminated. And I think it's important to raise awareness about these current events or certain things, because who you are, your race, your class, your gender, sexuality, where you grew up, that's important to your identity, and how it changes how you speak, and it changes how people see you. So I think promoting it in that way, and specifying it to these certain cultural organizations on campus would really make a difference.
So let me ask you, Jackson, and I'll ask Leilani the same thing. What other clubs have you been involved in, if you have been involved with other clubs at ASU while you were here?
Yeah, I've been involved in the Young Democrats Club, as well as the I'm into like stock market. So there's the Sun Devil Stock Exchange, as well as the Student Economics Association. Those are more of kind of interests of mine, as well as my major. But yeah.
Leilani?
Yeah, so I am in also Phi Alpha Delta, which is a pre-law fraternity. I'm also in Omega Phi Alpha, which is a service sorority. So they really focus on outreach with the community and kind of going to different places around the valley and helping out. I'm in the NSLS, which is the National Society of Leadership and Success. I'm also in If You're Reading This, which is a mental health club at Arizona State.
So you guys have a lot of club experience. I find that a lot with students. I ask them and they're like, they rattle off like 5 or 6 different clubs they've been into. And I think that's amazing. And I think we underestimate, the impact of those clubs in both the work we do and should do. So I think that's important. I want to switch to a topic. We have probably just time to discuss one major procedural justice item that will affect you guys as you're moving into the law school world, and that is these aspect of problem solving courts. And you may not be as familiar with them, but a good example would be drug court, veterans court, mental health court, these specialized courts that have been just kind of set up for, the purpose is. So I'll give you a good example. In Tempe, we have a veterans court and we have a mental health court. And they're specialized courts that basically they're set up in a docket so that if someone, for example, is caught with driving under the influence, they're brought into court under their initial hearing. If they qualify for as either a veteran or some serious mental health issue, their case can be diverted over to these problem solving courts, and they're different in the way they function because what happens is the judge who oversees that docket comes together in what we call a multidisciplinary team, and in doing so they bring in people from housing for the city of Tempe. They bring in the what we call the REBA, the mental health authorities for the county, rehabilitation type of individuals. And they're bringing in these outside individuals with the goal of providing services to an individual so that they can then get the help that they need. And then they decrease their sentence if they have a successful program experience. It's been it's been going on now for, I would say, probably at least 15 years. It started with the drug court with mixed results. And so I'm just curious, if you guys have heard of this and if you have any kind of things you would think about as in the area, things that you would think about would be good about these programs, or things that you wish maybe we could go even further on. So Leilani, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of experience. I've of course read about it a little bit. I think that these programs are kind of beneficial. Again, you see pros and cons. I do think a lot of the time when these courts probably weren't established, you see a lot of these people that get sentenced go through their sentence and then come out and have no idea kind of like what to do, or they, for instance, like drug court, they start using again, or for like mental health, they don't know how to kind of like go through that and help themselves. So I think being able to set up a court like this and be able to like go through these things and kind of make sure that they kind of have that checklist of, do you know who to talk to when you're having problems? Do you know how to get like these things like housing and safety and food established so they don't fall back onto the same route? Is very beneficial. And a lot of people don't necessarily know how to get those resources unless they're like straightly given to them. So I do think it's a really good kind of way. And hopefully in the future we do see kind of a better beneficial turnaround. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that response, Leilani. I think, one of the purposes of the law is to solve problems. And I think that, um, a problem-solving court is definitely beneficial for, the future of law. I haven't, done much, research or haven't read much about, these courts. But I think as Leilani was discussing, especially for drug offenders or those experiencing mental health crises or other, nonviolent crimes. These problem-solving courts can definitely be beneficial. Instead of, the rough nature of the criminal justice system. These courts can definitely be a breath of fresh air for the overall legal system.
That's wonderful. So we're getting close to where we want to make sure that we address any questions that are coming from our audience. So if you have any, if you could please put questions or comments in the chat. I'm just going to just follow up on a couple of things that I always found very interesting. Leilani kind of mentioned about it would be nice, if the courts can have people who can help, navigate people through things. I was shocked to find out that in the Tempe court, they have one resource navigator who's basically a social worker who has to do all the work, which I was shocked. And the courts even acknowledged that the that they cannot keep up with, because this one person, they're split and fragmented in so many different areas. So it was interesting it's always interesting to hear how the courts have tried to do stuff, but they don't have the level of resources with which to handle the volume or to handle these things. Let me look through the chat here real quick. Let's see. There was a question about, and this was mentioned in the podcast, that has restorative justice become more of a performance-based thing rather than really caring. I think, Jackson, you talked a little bit about that in a response, but I'm just curious, very quickly, what you guys think about that. I'll look for some other questions here. And so what do you think? Has it become, is restorative justice like some of these other things? It becomes the talking point of the day, and we just do it to do it. So what do you guys think about that? So go ahead, Jackson.
Yeah, I think, that kind of goes hand in hand with the, institutionalism of the legal field, where, I think they mentioned something, in the podcast of, the programs can't operate on breadcrumbs when they need 17 loaves of bread. When there's no, budget for proper training or professional development, should the program even exist, in the first place? And in terms of being, performative, um, I think one question that they ask in the podcast is, are the people who are involved in these practices truly committed to dismantling the harm that was done, or is it just a PR strategy to, be to think of themselves as, morally superior in being a part of these practices? They talk about, we're just happy to be in the room, mentality, where, if there's a fear of pushing too hard for change, the system, as it, stands right now remains intact, as opposed to, when to know when to walk away, and, when restorative justice is being used to validate a harmful system that's in place rather than to actually transform it. Determining when to actually stay or, fight that fight.
Leilani, any thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jackson. He kind of said that perfectly. I think that with a lot of these companies that you see that there's not enough budgeting to be able to kind of establish people that can solve these problems and be able to effectively do that. And half the time these people are there to kind of feel superior, feel like they're doing something just to get like that power. So I think moving kind of looking forward, that's like something that really needs to be kind of spotlit and kind of see the changes that they can make because there needs to be more people that want to do that to help people, not to necessarily have that power. And there needs to be a bigger budget within that company to be able to effectively do that.
Yeah, and my one of my favorite colleagues, Shelley Gordon, is in the audience and tonight, and she asked a question about how can community get involved in restorative justice programs, like in schools. And I have some personal experience in that area because we've actually, we speaking of the Tempe courts, they've tried to get school involvement, in thinking about different programs. In fact, we're working on a program right now. Law Day is May 1st, and it's all about celebrating different constitutional aspects, and this year it's all about one of many with regards to the Constitution and bring that awareness. And so my experience with schools has always been that you may have a great program idea, but what happens is it turns into, well, you can have a program, but these volunteers have to be vetted this way. So you begin to get these roadblocks of things set up. And I think we talked a little bit about this. You get these procedure, you get these intake things. And this was talked about in the podcast. They were talking about the fact that, many times getting people into a program is almost the hardest part because you have these intake barriers with things. And I think we see that in courts in general. We oftentimes talk about civil justice and how you can't address procedural justice until you address civil justice, because if a person can't get into the door of something, then how can procedural justice ever be envisioned? And that would be, individuals, have a very, very difficult time depending upon their ability to even gain access to courts. It's a very complicated process. In many cases, you need an attorney to bridge part of that. Attorneys are expensive. They don't do things for free. And so that civil justice aspect even comes before the procedural justice aspect. And so I always ask students what percentage of people get moved out of the system even before they get to the system. They can't get access through the door of whatever. And I know the courts like to make it sound like that this is not necessarily the case, but we know it is because we see it in all kinds of disputes. I hear it from students when they talk about the fact that they're dealing with rental problems here in the city of Tempe with landlords, et cetera. And they're like, I don't know what to do. And because they don't know what to do, they put up with something that a landlord tells them, which is probably not the correct situation, but they do it because they don't have the access into a particular system. So we have a couple more minutes. Jackson, let's start with you. Any last thoughts about this aspect of procedural justice or fairness that you want to kind of close with?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I kind of took away from the podcast is the importance of local elections. I've been involved in politics since I was 14, worked on campaigns, and I know how, candidates or politicians like to, win their next election. And, local elections are the offices that shape how restorative justice is used, whether it be at the county attorney level, whether it be at the school district level with programs being implemented in schools. And an elected official's willingness to support restorative justice depends on how much risk they think their constituents will tolerate, and how restorative justice is framed. Whether it is allowing someone to get away with a crime, or spoken about in another way. The political nature of crime and punishment. And I think that that's one way that if politicians, especially at the local level, have a better understanding, as well as their constituency, with what procedural fairness and restorative justice is, that can go a long way.
Leilani, any last thoughts?
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of Jackson, there was a really interesting kind of talk in the podcast. Forgot specifically who said it, but they were talking about elections as well, and a really big point that really hit home with me was with this change that we hopefully will see, we need a lot of these older individuals that have been kind of in this kind of repetitive motion of a lot of the same things. They need to give up their seat for these new people that want to come in and make a difference. And we're not really going to see that change until these people give up their seat, not necessarily make room for them, but fully step back and kind of show that. And I think that really hit me because we see all these people that are so interested and so ready to make this change and want to, but we need the people that came before us that have been doing these things to take a step back and kind of in a sense let us hold the reins and let us kind of show them what we can do and what we want to change.
I think that's great feedback too, because it is true. And I do remember that part, Leilani, that you're talking about in the podcast where they were talking about how do we, this entrenched thought pattern, how do you disrupt that and how do you keep it in different ways moving? And I think that's a challenge for us today because we're getting, in today's environment, it's becoming very easy for us to get entrenched in a particular pathway, and more people are pushing into that pathway. And so I do think that's an important, very, very important aspect. And so I want to thank both of you for joining me tonight as co-panelists on this panel. I really enjoyed talking with both of you. I think our student organizations have a lot to provide, and the two of you have just demonstrated that in giving us thoughts that we can use as we move forward. I know Dr. Lester values student voice, and I have followed his lead in that same area, that student voice is so important. We do want to take a moment and remind everyone that we, let me just.
I want to ask just a quick
Sure.
question before the
Yeah.
experts, the people who have a lot of knowledge and the general. I guess what's missing to me from this conversation about procedural fairness is, and I put this in the chat, is an acknowledgement of a history of justice or injustice in the country. So I guess I wonder, does restorative justice just presume we're starting at a place that's fair, and then fair itself has to be kind of teased out? And I got that from the podcast also, is that I didn't see any sort of historical awareness about, not among you, among in terms of like, we can't just imagine that things started off fair, and that fairness was never about equity. Fair was about equality, or people getting the same stuff. And the reality is that people don't always need the same stuff. They need what they need. And then the other question I had, and maybe that's a rhetorical question, is restorative justice seems to be more about individuals than systems. When we start asking about forgiveness, when we're asking, is the person made whole? And the systemic part seems to be sort of left to the individual. So am I misunderstanding the notion of social justice, or am I missing something in this question about procedural fairness?
I'm just going to chime in, then I'll let Jackson and them jump
Mhm.
in. when I always remind students that the law has a way of being very focused on a particular event. And like in criminal proceedings, we never talk about, well, what's the backstory of this that's going on with this? We're focused on the event in a particular time, and judges and attorneys do their best job to stay on that track and not allow evidence to ever come in that may taint that actual event. And so when you think about the law in that way, you realize very quickly that it can become a system driven around a forgetting of history. And because it ignores that history part, solely taking consideration around the event that exists. And that's the way the law constructs. So Jackson, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, I somewhat, agree and disagree with that. I'm interested in pursuing antitrust law, which is based on case law. And I'm writing my honors thesis right now, and there's 200 citations, and much of those are past cases from the 20th century and beyond. And we take our laws from today and base them off of those decisions from the past. And I think that the Constitution is quote unquote a living document. We change as the present day changes, and I think that the same can be said with restorative practices in looking at the need for reparations, or looking at past cases of inequities or inequality in both the legal system and socially overall, on what led to what led to these problems today, and reasoning more, get a better understanding of why this is happening in a macro sense.
Yeah,
Leilani? Yeah, go ahead.
kind of going off of that too, I think kind of a part that Jackson said, with the history aspect of it, we really do need to reflect back on a lot of these cases that we're kind of going over, and kind of show appreciation almost to kind of the things that we're seeing now and what needs to be implemented and what can be revised, and kind of just also what Jackson said, that we see a lot of these things that are changing within our society, that we need to kind of almost in a sense step back, reflect on what has happened in history, but also what can be changed to prevent things from happening again.
Okay.
This aspect of stare decisis, which is to let previous case law or let previous cases decide our decisions. I always, and Jackson, I'm happy you brought this up, because I always remind students that the law has a way of having these procedural aspects that give the impression that they are taking advantage of or looking at historical aspects, when in fact it can be. This is the old judicial activism argument that goes on and is going on right now quite broadly in the country, is does stare decisis, or some of these judicial processes, do they lead to what Dr. Lester was mentioning about, which is, are they leading to equality or equity, or what is the goal of it? And this is something we could have we do have whole courses on to talk about it.
Right.
But it is.
No, that was good. That was good. That addressed what I was interested in. I like the fact that we can leave here, or I can leave here thinking of some other things and not feel like it was all resolved. So I can't thank you three enough. So let's all give them a round of applause for joining us. We do invite you to sign the pledge. The pledge, I hope, is about a way of foregrounding these conversations, but also underpinning these conversations around, are we losing our humanity? We ask you to consider the feedback form as you sign out, and do take the pledge. You can either scan that now that's on the screen. There will be a resource email with some resources that both our panelists and Dr. Broberg can put together, nothing like homework. But in case there's some organizations that are doing this work, or some of the resources that you know of that didn't actually come up in the conversation, but maybe later on we will share those with not just those who attended, but those who also registered. You can stay connected with us through the various social media platforms. You see the usual suspects there. To learn more about our mission and upcoming events. And the most immediate event is actually 2 days from today. It will be in person, and we do try to alternate between virtual and in person for those who are local. And that one will be a sharing event on the poet Nikki Giovanni, who passed away back in December. And you don't necessarily have to be a Nikki Giovanni expert to participate in this. It's just a sharing. It's not a lecture. It is not a panel, but rather a facilitated conversation for those who are interested in Nikki Giovanni. What has her life, what has her legacy meant to you personally? So please feel free to join us. It'll be at the Changing Hands Bookstore in Tempe. And we are very excited. We thank you again, Dr. Broberg, for bringing the podcast to us and walking us through and sort of showing us what the next generation of attorneys has in store for us. So thank you all for coming, and do come back for the other events that are on our website. They're all free and open to the public, and we appreciate having all perspectives, or many perspectives and multiple perspectives presented in our programming. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If people want to stay on the line, we'd love to take a picture of our group so that we can let people know that we did in fact have people and we weren't just talking to ourselves. So if you'd like to stay on and like your cheery smile to be in our group picture, we'd love for you to do that right now as our team gets ready to snap the picture. So,
All right, I will count down from 3.
okay.
3, 2, 1. Perfect, guys. Thanks.
All right. Anybody else who wanted to be part of it and didn't get to do it? I see some people still on the line. You're welcome to join us. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good evening. Good night. And we will debrief with our team and get ready for Thursday's event. Thank you. Thanks, Jackson, Leilani.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Broberg. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
team.